Hi, everyone. My name again is Winfred Amwako. I am the growth marketing lead here at Akiva, and I'm very excited today to take you on today's discussion on our next series on supply chain transformation. In today's webinar, we shall discuss a practical guide for implementing sales and operations planning. We are happy today to invite the COO of Akiva as well, Sujit Singh, to join us for a discussion. Sujit, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yes, sure, Vin. Thank you. So my name is Sujit Singh. I've been with Arkiva close to 21 years now and have helped many of our customers implement sales and operations planning, both from a software as well as a process point of view. Vin, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sujit. But before we get started, I would like to mention that if at any point in time you have trouble hearing us, please let us know by using the chat feature in the GoToWebinar window, and we will be sure to assist you. We would also reserve a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, but we also implore you to please just access questions, go through your chat window and just send us a question, and we will be sure to answer those questions during the webinar. But I would like to quickly give an overview of who we are. Next slide, please. So we are Akiva, and we are very excited to welcome you to today's discussion. Next slide, please. And to give you a quick overview of who we are, we believe that improved business performance starts with better planning. And as a result, next slide, please. And as a result, your Akiva team has only one goal in mind, which is to ensure that you achieve better planning without forcing you to fit a software mold. So we celebrate your unique business processes, and this gives you the power to keep your business processes intact. So we start every Akiva solution creation process with just one question in mind, and that question is, how can we empower you with a better planning process? So our goal is to put you in the driver's seat and to steer your business to improve business goals. Next slide, please. So Akiva One Plan. So Akiva One Plan sales and operation planning are used today by over 17 users worldwide in the process, chemical, food, and beverage industry, as well as discrete industries, to plan supply chain operations for product revenues of over $50 billion. So over the years, we have expanded our reach. Akiva is now a global company, providing with offices in North America, Europe, and South and Asia Pacific. Next slide, please. So to give you a quick overview of our full suite One Plan S&OP solution, we defined One Plan S&OP solution as an integrated demand-driven sales and operations planning process for dynamic business performance. And it promotes cross-functional synchronization across company, starting from integrated financial planning to demand, inventory management to a more dynamic S&OP management process using real-time dashboard. So our discussion today encompasses every layer of our solution suite. Next slide, please. So we are excited to bring you today's episode on our supply chain transformation series. But before we get into the weeds of today's discussion, I want to provide a quick recap on what we have discussed so far in this series. So we started off with the topic on 6 practical approaches to supply chain transformation and systems implementation. And this topic covered the steps and best practices on how to carry out supply chain transformation project for your business. Next. So our second episode on the series was on the topic of how to build a case for your sales and operations planning, which was really intriguing, very interesting topic. This topic, this episode talk more about how to clearly illustrate and articulate the value that your supply chain transformation would generate for your business. So all these episodes are very captivating, and we strongly encourage you to watch the recorded webinar on our website. But in our next series, we would also have topics on hierarchical supply chain planning and S&OP execution, as well as the next would also cover topics on supply chain finance. Finance and supply chain connection. So what is the connection between supply chain and finance? But for today's discussion, today's episode, Sajid Sen, our COO, would take us on the step-by-step approach on how to successfully implement and improve your S&OP process. Without much to say, I would like to invite Sajid to take us on this insightful journey. Take it over, please.
All right, thank you, Vin. So we'll talk about today this idea of different steps that might be needed in making sure our supply chain solution implementation is a success. And so some of the things we'll go through, what are the types of things you should be looking for in a planning system. We'll talk a little bit about what the solution selection steps might be. We will talk about the need for the data, the need for an underlying transaction system. These days, so much is data driven. We'll identify the different steps in scope. We will sequence them in a way that makes the most sense. And we'll work on developing what we call a wiring diagram, which will show us what needs to be done, when should it be done, and who should be doing it. All right. So let's paint the context. Let's imagine that we are a company or a business unit embarking on this S&OP journey. And, this company might be, the current situation might be that we are doing all our planning in Excel or other spreadsheets, or we might have a homegrown system, a legacy system of some sort. We might be doing our planning in a combination of ERP and Excel. Very often what that means is we do practically all of the planning in Excel and copy paste it into ERP. We might have bought a best of breed solution 10, 15 years ago, and we might be, outgrowing it. And so we might be doing a whole lot of it again in Excel. And so this might be a situation, and maybe we are looking for a change. Now, people look for change in this context for different reasons. Obviously, one is that you might have outgrown an existing solution, whether it's spreadsheets or legacy system or some old best of breed system. Sometimes an executive is hired from outside, from some other firm, who comes in and talks about the systems that they have used and the S&OP that they had and how effective it was, and shows a desire to get you to that same level. Sometimes it takes a crisis. Sometimes there might be a crisis where you are unable to meet customer orders, or maybe you have too much inventory, therefore exposing again a need for you to have a better quality plan, a better quality system. So those might be the reasons. So in this context, where this company has decided to start this journey, we will frame today's discussion, and we'll talk about the appropriate sequence in which they should go about attacking these things. Now, your context might be slightly different, and as you look at the steps in the journey today, you might say, well, we have already done some part of it. Our problem is in a different area. We will adopt a slightly different sequence, and that's perfectly fine, of course. Now, in the previous sessions that Win talked about in our webinar series, Tapan, when he presented the 6 steps towards the transformation journey, he made the case for how it's the people, the process, and the systems, and one needs to really think about all 3. So if we look at the people column all the way on the left, when we are thinking about this improvement path, we need to obviously have them informed. They need to understand where we are going to use. They need to be involved in making the selection. And then they need to begin the use. And if they make good use over time, obviously, they will be internalizing the ways the system works. And if all goes beautifully, exactly to plan, eventually one would see them champion different parts of a solution or the selected solution. When we think of processes, obviously, processes are very important part of the improvement process. One cannot ignore them. So when you declare such a project or a desire to go through this, very often you have disconnected sub processes. Now, once you go through the acquisition and implementation, hopefully you begin to get into some kind of a routine execution, and over time this could mean that your sub-processes from disconnected, they move towards more synchronized. And then eventually, a tool like this could help the process by becoming the default place where problems are resolved. So for example, if you have a demand statement that is uh, out of pattern, rather than have a discussion on the back of an envelope or on a whiteboard or in an Excel sheet, you come to the system that you select where you resolve these problems. And then as far as the systems themselves, the technology itself is concerned, you got to you got to start with collecting data. You got to know where your data feed is going to come from. You got to work on aggregating and analyzing the data. And hopefully by the time the implementation is done, at the very least, you are diagnosing your problems and working through the systems in an effective way. Over time, if all goes well, this system should be able to learn and then provide better options for you in terms of how you would resolve your S&OP issues. And in the very long term, it should be able to optimize your entire supply chain. So the improvement path includes all these three channels: the people, the process, the systems or technology. And one cannot change the system, which is the thrust of today's presentation, without understanding and without taking care of the impact on the people and the processes. So in this context, change management is very important. No one, certainly people do not love to the idea of going through change. So one needs to worry about those types of things as well. Now, Tapan already covered this in his webinar a few weeks ago. And as Vin pointed out, the recording is available. So I strongly encourage people to watch it. Now, let's get into today's discussion a little bit more. And let's talk about, now we are talking about a planning system that we are going to implement. So let's begin at the very beginning and say should we look for in such a system. So if I look at the first two boxes here, the standard and non-standard, the idea here is that people uh, sometimes get hung up on this idea that whatever they need must be available as a standard out of the box feature in whatever technology they buy. Now, one has to understand that standard a vendor would put in standard systems that are applicable to a wide variety of customers, but not all customers. And one needs to realize that as far as your particular business is concerned, a unique feature of your supply chain might actually be the differentiator when it comes to competition. And certainly there could be some examples, not necessarily as a differentiator, but examples of uniqueness could be that in your business you need to plan for empty containers which need to be returned from the customer. Or maybe you are in the CPG industry, and in your business you need to really think about point of sale data. So these are examples of features which may be standard in some software, may not be standard in some other software. I can assure you that no matter which software you pick, there might be a need for configuring 2 or 3 or 4 things that really make the solution unique to your particular business. And so in that sense, the second box, the configurability, comes into play. People should not worry too much about the standard features and really look at ease of configurability when it comes to the non-standard features as far as that particular tool is concerned. Then one needs to think about the future. We'll talk today about multiple steps. If you are buying the software to do one of those steps today, and if you have plans to do the other steps later on, so even though you're buying one link of the chain today, you need to then evaluate as part of your software evaluation and vendor evaluation process whether or not it provides you the capability to cover the entire chain. Then one needs to also worry about planning versus transaction. We are talking here about sales and operations planning. Definitely in the planning realm, we are looking out next 18 months or so. Transactions, on the other hand, are very detailed, very execution focused, maybe next week, maybe next 2 days. And in that sense, one should make sure that they do not confuse and look for a system that kind of stretches from planning all the way to transactions. Transactions should be left. For example, if you want to have a truck building, a load building for trucks as part of the solution, maybe that should be left in a transaction system. Maybe it's a TMS systems approach as opposed to an S&OP systems approach. So planning versus transaction, people should be very, very careful about what they look for in a planning system. Obviously, as the name suggests, you should be looking for planning functionality and not transactional functionality. And then last but not the least, in the selection, you need to go for the right vendor. It's a partnership. That means that you have to obviously have the right technology, but you need to have the right implementation partner as well. Right implementation partner could mean they should have offices where you need them. They should speak the language that you need them to speak. They should have some kind of cultural match. All those things are very, very important in selecting the right vendor. So when we think about solution selection steps, typically one could go to tools available on the web, tools like the Magic Quadrant from Gartner or other lists that might exist out there. And from a long list based on certain attributes, they might filter down to a few. So what might be an example of a filtering down based on attributes? You might say, well, I'm a business based in North America. Do they have implementation teams available for me in North America? Or I have most of my users, let's say, speak Vietnamese, and therefore, do they have the capability for the system to operate in Vietnamese? Whatever that might be, you might use these attributes, start from a long list. A typical MQ, probably MQ stands for Magic Quadrant. So typical Gartner Magic Quadrant on sales and operations planning has 15 to 20 vendors listed. You might start from that list, but then you might filter it down to 2 to 3. And that probably would be our recommendation as to the number you would move forward with. Now, once you have that, then you would get into the mode of detailed demonstration. You might, even move to an idea of a proof of concept where you give them some of their data and then ask them to show particular things using your data. Certainly conduct reference calls. Then you have to go towards selecting the partner, as mentioned previously. Selection does involve the tool, but also involves the implementation team itself. I'm sure, as any business does, you will probably go through some kind of negotiation and then eventually initiate the project. So these are the steps. All the way on the left, starting from a long list, maybe doing quick demos and other attribute-based filtering to get to 2 to 3, and then carrying on with the rest of the process. And by the time you select the partner, you're down to 1. That's where you do the negotiation and then eventually initiate with that partner. So those are the selection steps. Now, when we talk about planning the supply chain, and let's just imagine that that whole selection process is a whole separate process. But now let's talk about the system itself and the implementation steps. So when we are talking about the implementation, one thing that comes out very clearly is the need for data. And the schematic here shows you the types of data you will need. So obviously we will need master data, things like products and customers and locations. We would also need transactional data, things like demand related data. What might be our open orders, what might be our past actuals, your average selling price, your revenue data, your promotion data. On the planning data side, we might need things like bill of materials, we might need production rates, we might need bill of distribution. And then other transactional data could mean we need past transfers, we need past productions, we need past purchases, we need current inventory, we need the inventory targets if it exists anywhere. So all of this data is needed, and this makes supply chain planning system data intensive systems. So we need a system hopefully already in place that records all of these types of data. Typically, we call it a transaction system, but these days the more popular name is obviously ERP. And so because these needs are intense, the transaction system is then a fundamental foundational backbone to enable the supply chain planning system. And thankfully, in this day and age, almost all companies have an ERP system, and so we can get data from there. Now, ERP systems, MES, which is manufacturing execution systems, companies might even just have data marts in place. These are the different places where you can get to these systems, these data points, I should say. Next thing is to think about what would be the steps one would consider when going through S&OP. Now, our research points to the 5 steps on the screen, and so let me walk you through them. Uh, first and foremost is the demand, and the reason we like to start with demand is, we like to say it's the head of the beast. That's what leads everything. That's where your supply chain needs to really respond to is the demand that is placed on it from the marketplace. So when we talk about the very first step, we say the first investment needs to go into understanding the demand that is being placed by your customer. This allows us to better position ourselves to service our customers. The next step typically involves understanding our inventory. Do we have what kind of visibility do we have into that? Do we know where the slow moving ones are and where the fast moving ones are, where the obsolete ones are and where we have not enough? And then do we have a sense of what targets should look like? How much inventory should we really plan to carry? Then after these 2 steps, typically one gets into collaborative demand planning. This is the step where one likes to utilize any and all techniques to generate the best forward-looking projection, best forward-looking demand statement. So this is where we use some math or statistics. This is where we ask our salespeople to collaborate with us, maybe marketing people to collaborate with us, provide their forecast, maybe sometimes even customers where it makes sense. Although, collaborating with customers should always be done with care. So whatever that is, get all of these different types of input to get the best possible forward-looking demand statement. And then the idea of, in the 4th step, the idea of balancing the supply and the demand. And so this is the idea where what we want to do is take the demand statement generated in the 1st step, take the inventory targets generated in the 2nd step, and then take those numbers, plug it in, and see what is possible. Can we meet this demand? Can we meet this demand in a timely fashion? What, if not, which demand it is that we must disregard, or which is the customer which will not be, whose demand will not be met? So typically, at the end of this, we are getting a capacity feasible sales plan. If demand is what we think, demand plan indicates what we think the customers are going to need from us. The sales plan indicates what we think we can sell to them. And this typically includes aggregated capacity requirement planning, or CRP. It includes aggregate DRP, distribution requirement planning. It includes, again, aggregate material requirement planning. And sometimes it also includes MPS, the master production schedule. It does not and should not go to any more detailed level than that. So this is not a day-by-day or shift-by-shift scheduling balancing of supply and demand. This is some aggregate level of balancing the supply and the demand. And then that should be fed into an S&OP process where executives are looking at these plans and making decisions about what the business will do into the next 6, 7, 10, 12, 18 months. So that's the idea of the S&OP planning and the steps that are involved and are recommended by Arqiva. Now, typically, the fun does not end at S&OP. Gartner actually calls the next few steps as S&OE, or sales and operations planning. Sales and operations execution, or sometimes they also call it response planning. And the idea is that once you have these decisions on the high level plan, you need to begin to break it down into execution steps. So that's the time when you might take it into a detailed production schedule, where you might be breaking this down to hour by hour, or certainly shift by shift level. At that level, you might also be generating a very detailed distribution plan, where you are saying this truck or these many trucks will move from this location to that location today and arrive 2 days from now. It will have also a detailed materials requirement plan, so that we can see what things need to be moved to the production floor today in order to make the production happen. And eventually, it leads into things like order promising, able to promise, capable to promise. So all of those steps are important, necessary, but not necessarily part of SNOP. In fact, as far as Arqiva thinks, if you line all these steps up, so we are going from understanding customer demand all the way to the SNOP plan, and then circling back to scheduling of the operations, which has a lot more detail, all the way down to CTP, ATP. Typically, in round one, when we talk about SNOP improvements, we exclude these things. We do not try to implement technology in these areas. We target these areas first. Now, what is a plan to make this happen? So we have a prescriptive series of steps. The process begins with pre-kickoff interviews, and these interviews, we'll talk about, but this is where we establish what we will do, what the business problems are. It leads into creating what we call a wiring diagram. Wiring diagram is like a sequence of events which shows us how the planning is conducted, who does what, when do they do it. That is very important to have documented as part of the initiation of the project. Then obviously you have project kickoff. You like to have a kickoff meeting. You like to bring people together. You want to have some kind of an excitement, maybe a nice meal. Certainly a speech from an executive to establish the importance of the project. And then you begin to get into the nitty-gritty of the steps. So you might do step one, certainly in our methodology, that is understanding customer demand. Once you do that, typically we recommend a short pause, sometimes longer than others, but the pause is there to institutionalize any changes. So whatever you learned here, don't just rush into step two. Try to use it for a few months. Try to make sure your process change happens, the change management happens, so that you are now using the learnings from the step one in a constructive way before you move on to step two. So each step can have a pause after it. The length of the pause can depend on the severity of the step. It can also depend on the seasonality of the business itself. We have customers, for example, who are in the retail industry, and Christmas time is peak time for them. So around that time, they usually take a long pause. And then, of course, you go through all the steps. You end with some kind of a retrospective to see what did you do right, what did you do wrong. In fact, one could argue every step could have their own kickoff. It could have its own respective retrospective, as well as its own wiring diagram. So these are the steps, and this type of an implementation is always an opportunity to tweak the existing process as well. So let's not forget that it's not just a systems implementation. So let's break some of these down. When we talk about pre-kickoff interviews, we are talking about identifying key business concerns. So we have interviews with people, hopefully with two people, both taking notes and those types of things, just the standard way of doing a good interview. But this is where we are trying to understand, as at the beginning of the project, what are the key concerns. For example, they might have outgrown the existing systems, or they might have too few inventory turns, or they might be missing orders. Then there is an attempt to assess the business complexity, things like how many people, how many products, how many customers, how many locations, and those types of things. And then, of course, one needs to understand that whether or not there are challenges around the planning itself. For example, they might have key raw materials that are shared across almost every finished good of theirs. And so then the question becomes, do we need to optimize the usage of this key raw material? So that's the idea of assessing the complexity. And then finally, we need to make sure that the entire team is harmonized on the business language. If one team, if their salespeople are not called salespeople, but instead are called account managers, then the vendor team needs to be harmonized on that. If their forecasting process is called projections, then, or a blue book or a green book, then you need to harmonize on that. So these interviews basically allow us to collect information and put it in writing, the concerns, the complexity, as well as the language. Once that happens, we begin to move into the next step, which is the developing of the wiring diagram. Now, why do we need to do that? Well, in S&OP type of processes, there are many moving parts, many participants. There's the whole tyranny, as I call it, of the calendar. You have to finish everything within the month because, or planning cycle, let's say, because sometimes it can even be a week, and you have to make sure everything fits in. So wiring diagram allows us to elaborate what is done, by who, and by when. So let's walk through an example of developing a wiring diagram. And here, let's start with a range of activities. So let's say we are going to do collaborative demand planning. We'll come out with something that we call the demand plan, the forward-looking demand statement. Then we'll do some kind of balancing of that supply, the balancing of that the supply to that demand that is coming out of it. It helps to remember that it's always the supply that is being balanced into the demand. The demand is independent. It comes from outside. So really, we are managing and balancing as best as we can the supply to the demand. And then finally, we want to do some S&OP planning, and maybe in the longer horizon, we even want to do the capable to promise. So some of these processes are monthly, some of these processes can be daily, and so on. Now the question becomes, if this were the range of outcomes we were after, how would we go about establishing the wiring diagram? So what we do is we'll take the individual steps and we begin to break it down. So here is the S&OP plan. Well, let's talk about what are the things that come out of the S&OP plan. Well, we have the material requirements coming out, which we will then send to the purchasing department. So we need to worry about that in this plan. We need to have the transport requirements, which will be sent to the distribution or the logistics team. Things like how many trucks we will need, and will we need to book a barge or not, and those types of things. So, well, we need to include that in the S&OP plan. We obviously need to worry about manufacturing. So we need to think about production targets, which plant will make which product, and those types of things. And so that might obviously be, and that will be needed by the manufacturing folks. So we need to include that. And then in the a little bit further down the future, when we actually look at scheduling, very detailed scheduling plan, well, we might need to then again consider sending that to the manufacturing. Now that may actually, in fact, other than the MPS level, we will not be considering that as part of the S&OP plan. And so what comes out of S&OP is this capacity feasible sales plan. It has already taken into account these constraints, the material, the transport, the production targets, and that's what is coming out of here. Now, so if those are the steps in the S&OP plan, let's now put a little bit more detail into the collaborative demand plan. So now this area is the S&OP thing that we just worked on. Now we are going towards the collaborative demand planning, and that might require us to get the historical orders and shipments from the ERP system, run some kind of a statistical forecasting, so to generate the statistical forecast. If we are a CPG type of company, we might want to then include things like promotions and price changes and include that. So that would be incorporated as part of the promotion plan. And then because this is collaborative in nature, we will of course be getting input maybe from customers, maybe from marketing, maybe from the sales folks. And so all of that can go into the collaborative demand planning. And over the long horizon, if we want to include capable to promise, some of that same data will feed into capable to promise as well. And then that will be consolidated with the sales plan so that one can use it to supply the product to the customer. So if we look at that entire picture, we might then decide, oh, guess what? We might have to actually think about transport issues. Maybe a bridge is out over the long haul. Maybe in summer months, the river goes too low and we cannot push the barge up the river. So we have to worry about that. We might have to think about inventory imbalances. We might have to think about targets of inventory. Uh, as we do that, a lot more data comes into the play, things like rates and bill of materials and those types of things. So now you can see here, uh, I understand this is a busy slide, and that's my point. This does become quite complex, and you cannot handle all of this in one go. So then you begin to say, well, we will understand the demand as part of step one. We might do the inventory analysis as part of step two. The collaborative demand planning might be step three. The balancing of the supply and demand might be step four. Step five is where we will get together, we will make the S&OP level decisions. And step six, which we might leave at least in Arqiva's way of working for a little bit further out in the future, is where we will get into the detailed scheduling and ATP and CTP and those types of things. So these 6 steps are the part of the Arqiva methodology. Step one, the idea is that it lays the foundation for forecasting by making sure you understand your demand a lot better. Step two provides the ability to monitor and analyze your inventories, set targets. Step three creates your forward-looking demand plan. Step four allows you to balance the supply with the demand. Then step five is where it allows you to get the executives in so that they can see and comment on and make judgments on the final plan. Step six is where scheduling and capable and able to promise and order commitment types of things are done. And typically, as I mentioned, step six is done as part of subsequent implementation in Arqiva's way of working. So really, it's the first 5 steps that we do in the S&OP implementation. Why are these first 5 steps foundational? We feel that they are foundational because they point us towards doing more effective versus efficient, as in it helps us towards what is more important to do, as opposed to doing the same things faster, better, and so on, which is where the scheduling will help. It focuses our mind on the what versus the how. How is important, efficient is important, but what is more important than the how? Effective is more important than the efficient. It allows us a possibility to align the plan with the business strategy. Once you are down in the detail, once you have taken the order already, you are just reacting how to make that order. If you want to align yourself with the overall business strategy, you have to be one level up. And so let me round all that up with a quote. If you do not know where you are going, I've seen 2 versions of that. One version says, any road will get you there, or no road will get you there. The point being that it's best to establish where you are going as part of your S&OP process before you get into the nitty-gritty of the execution. So that's why Arqiva always recommends going through these first 5 steps. So if you put that in a slightly different graphic, step one is where you're understanding the demand and the order stream. You're putting in place metrics for order fulfillment. Step two is where you are creating the process for analyzing inventory, looking at excesses or shortfalls or mismatches, creating targets. Step three is where you are creating the demand planning process so that you can execute it routinely. You're setting your forecasting metrics. Step five is where you will have the model to balance the supply and the demand. You might identify some opportunities for optimization depending on your business. Step five is where you get your executives involved. This is where your this is where your interface from planning to scheduling to execution gets developed eventually. And then step six, which is colored differently because we like to do it a little bit later, this is where you take it all the way into order promising and those types of things. So each of these steps can have its own wiring diagram, like I had said earlier. So here is an example of a demand wiring diagram. You will notice here, this is a swimming lane type of a paradigm where we have different types of users on the left. We have demand managers doing majority of the things. Then we have sales managers and segment managers and S&OP managers, and all of them through the timeline of the month. If you look from left to right, that's the timeline of the month. They are doing different things at different parts of the month. So even though we have a wiring diagram of the overall process, When we get to the demand planning part of the project, which is step 3, the collaborative demand planning, we might have a need to develop a much more detailed wiring diagram just for that part of the project. So every project might require its own wiring diagram as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the different steps. When we say understand customer demand, what exactly are we talking about? Well, we are talking about analyzing your demand across a lot of different analyzing attributes. For example, we might do ABC analysis on the volume. We might do ABC analysis on the revenue. Heck, we might do ABC analysis on margins. We might do some kind of variability analysis to see which portions of the data is forecastable versus not forecastable. We might want to see where the customer counts are increasing, where the customer counts are decreasing. Same for the order count. We might want to analyze what % of our demand comes in as next day orders. We might want to see if customers give us 1-day lead time or a 5-day lead time or 7-day lead time or a 3-month lead time when they place their orders. We might want to see our data as margin versus volume. So, and then we might want to establish forecastability. Is our data seasonal? What % of our data is seasonal? What % of our data is intermittent? So these are just some thought provokers, thought starters on the different types of analysis one might do when one tries to understand customer demand. Now, it might require data from the ERP system, and it might require tools that can do this type of a segmentation analysis. If we go to step 2, where we talk about analyzing inventory, similar idea, we might look at, for example, what parts of our business are suited for lean, what parts of businesses are suited for agile. Are there products where we should consider make to order, make to stock, make to negotiate? Which parts and how big of the parts are slow moving and obsolete? What does our days of supply picture look like? What does our fill rate picture look like? Are we providing a good service to our customer or bad? What does our supply lead time look like? Calculating things like safety stocks and target stocks. We might do things like turn earn analysis, where we are combining the idea of inventory turns to the margin to see if we are properly balanced. And we might look at EOQ, economic order quantity, and lot size analysis to see if our lot sizes are too big or too small or things like that. We might look at carrying costs. So a lot of steps. These are just thought provokers on the second step, where we might be looking at the data in a lot of different ways as it pertains to the inventory data. Then when it comes to the third step, the collaborative demand planning, we might begin with collecting the historical data and then be looking at how much of it is out of pattern. Do we need, outlier removal and things of that nature? How much of that is needing realignment? Maybe we were selling something as named product A yesterday, and today we are changed the formula and we'll be selling it as product B. Well, do we need to realign that? We might need to look at past performance of our forecast, and then go through several steps of mathematical and promotion-based and input-based forecasting to come to a final number where we establish that as our final demand plan, which we might then publish into our S&OP meeting. And then when it comes to balancing the supply and demand, this tends to be a lot more heavy on data. So we might begin with things like data diagnostics. We might have a model to configure, and then we might calculate things like aggregate CRP, aggregate DRP, aggregate MRP, and possibly MPS. CRP is capacity requirements, DRP is distribution, and MRP is material requirements. So one might do all these calculations as part of this balancing of supply and demand. Now, I use the word aggregate. That simply means that we are doing this in a monthly or weekly level. We are not going down to a shift by shift or hour by hour level. We might have decisions to be made around whether we use an optimization based engine or a rule based engine or a rough cut capacity planning engine. Certainly one would want to evaluate a lot of scenarios and what if, and then of course once we finalize that, then we publish it as an official plan. And then finally, once that plan is published, we take it to our meeting, and in that meeting, we might spend, typically the recommendation is that it's an hour-long meeting, And in that first 15 minutes, we might spend on the past plans and the performance and performance of those past plans. And then we might have a knowledge repository to track some of the assumptions and those types of things. And then we might talk a little bit about what is the official plan look like, what are the guardrails or the limits within which this plan is valid, and then what, if any, what ifs that we have run, and how does that impact that overall plan. And then as output, we might actually publish certain financial worksheets, KPIs and dashboards, and certainly the types of things that will allow us to control the sales process. And so if we look at all of that in the Arqiva worldview, the types of steps we are talking about here, we start with generating the demand plan, ending up with demand review meeting, then generating the supply plan with a supply review meeting, then finally having a consensus plan, which moves into the S&OP meeting. And of course, whatever solution you use in Arqiva's world, of course, we provide modules that support to each of these boxes, but whatever you go through your implementation, you will need technology that covers the individual boxes. So here, for generating the demand plan, we have a few modules. Generating the supply plan, we have a few other modules. For the consensus generation, we have a few more modules. And then, of course, you would want to bring into this S&OP the idea of history, the past plans, the performance of said past plans, and any alternatives that were discovered and discussed. So this idea of going across this diagonal to evaluate to run the S&OP meeting is what the whole enterprise is about, and what you should be looking at in terms of going through this improvement journey is this the right process? And if so, then do we have the modules that support this? And then what is the right sequence in which to implement? And certainly I've presented to you the Arqiva's preferred and suggested sequence, which deals with understanding customer demand, analyzing inventories, then leading into collaborative demand planning, and then leading into balancing the supply with the demand, and finally into this S&OP meeting that we are describing here. That's what I wanted to present to you today. If I summarize this, what we have and what we always recommend for someone who is coming out of an Excel mindset is that they need a prescriptive approach. It should be well defined. The sequence should be logical and well defined so that people have something to follow. This is not to say that every company will follow this sequence exactly. You might have reasons to do one of the steps before the other. At least it allows you to ask yourself questions about why you are not going exactly by the prescribed approach, why you are taking a different approach, and hopefully there's a logical reason why you are, in which case it's fine. This sequence in our worldview creates the most possible value for the businesses that implement it. And of course, it also enables process changes and takes people along. We have found that it's difficult for people to directly jump into the supply side of things, for example, because the questions there are a lot more complex than the demand side things. So if you follow the sequence, we have found that people find it easier to go through the journey, because it is a journey. And while the end goal is easy to say that we must achieve that very quickly, for good or bad reasons, it is a journey. It takes a while to get there. So having a prescriptive approach, having a step-by-step approach makes it more logical for us to attain the most possible value in any business environment. So with that, I have presented what I wanted to talk about. Now, Vin talked about this being a series of webinar. All of our webinars are available on arqiva.com /webinars. So you're welcome to peruse the ones that we have presented in the past. We do keep the recordings there. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Vin and see if there are any questions that we need to get through.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sajid, for this insightful discussion. We would like to also open up the pipelines for questions. So please, you can go straight to your GoToWebinar questions window and begin to input your question. So Sajid, I have a question for you with regards to industry type. So how does industry type play in the role of this practical approaches? Does it differ by industry?
Yeah, it absolutely does. If let's take the example. Let's take an example of an automotive industry versus a CPG industry. And I will make a very general statement. And hopefully, it doesn't come across as flip. But I might say that the automotive industry, the way it is structured, with assembly lines and what have you, the production planning part of it might be somewhat easier than in process industry, where typically, we have a customer, for example, they rely heavily on methanol as the raw material, and depending on how much methanol they can procure from the marketplace, the number of molecules of methanol that they have as supply really drives how they will use, what products they can make, and how much money they can make. So now for them, the requirement becomes very much optimization oriented, because they really need to optimize the use of those methanol molecules, which may sound completely foreign to someone, an executive who is coming from an automotive industry. Similarly, if someone is coming from a CPG industry, they might live and die by the promotions that they have. They really have to worry about that is in their demand planning. Versus a chemical industry executive might have nothing to do with promotions. In fact, I've never heard of a buy one rail car, get one rail car free offer. I don't think it exists. So, from their point of view, promotion planning is not required even a little bit. So, indeed, different industries will have different focus areas, and one needs to be aware of it and adapt the final, both the technology selection as well as the sequence of steps to that. However, the 5-step methodology that I've talked about, at least in my experience, does work very well across a lot of different industries.
Got it.
Vin?
Awesome. Yep, I'm still here. Thank you so much. So we still have the pipelines open. I'm still waiting on our audience to provide us with some questions. But one question that comes to mind, or one follow-up that comes to mind, is also on the topic of like building the business case for supply chain, for sales and operations planning. So I'm also thinking in the sense that, like, how would you be able to convince your team to collaboratively work with you on improving your processes, and also how can you sell the idea to your business leaders in terms of sales and operations improvement?
It's a great question. Remember, we talked about, as part of this process, the very first thing is the pre-kickoff interviews, and in the pre-kickoff interviews, we talked about identifying the business concern. So if that has happened, and we have documented that in this particular business case, the main concern is that they are missing orders, or the main concern is that they have too much inventory, and certainly doesn't have to be just one, it can be one, it typically is multiple, then really, and we talked about this, Brahm and I did in our previous webinar, really the question then becomes, how can we dollarize it? And dollarization is a discipline, you must practice it, and Brahm talked about it at the high level, but this is where you kind of talk about the net present value, and how much money will you save? Is this a one-time saving? Is this an ongoing saving? But all of that, the dollarization of it is very important, and that provides the tangible part of the ROI, the measurable part of the ROI, and that is typically what is needed to convince the management. Having said that, one should not ignore the intangible part. If it will save time, and maybe no one can agree on how to quantify or dollarize the time saving, but certainly saving time is a saving. So, well, let's not forget the intangible. Let's say, for example, today the planner spends most of their time just collecting data, and tomorrow with the system that does the integration automatically, data integration automatically, maybe they are spending more time planning. Now, maybe that's difficult to quantify, but it must be mentioned. So when I think about making a business case, I think about both the tangibles and the intangibles. And in fact, my own personal methodology, I try to, and when I say personal, sorry, I should say our Kiva methodology, we try to set up what we call a balanced scorecard, where we try to set it up across the 4 axes. How will it help the customer? How will it help internally? What are the learning learning that will come out of it? And all of that, we have a blog on this, the balanced scorecard approach to ROI. My suggestion is to use that type of an approach to write it down and present it to the management so that you can show both the tangibles and the intangibles across those 4 axes of the balanced scorecard.
Awesome. So on that end, on that note, focusing on the tangible and the intangible is my last takeaway from this whole discussion, which I would also leave with our audience whilst they brood on it for the rest of the day. I would like to firstly say thank you so much to Sujit for really joining us today and for providing us with such detailed and insightful presentation. I would also like to thank our audiences for taking the time to join us. And we do really appreciate your time. Have a great day, everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.